The upcoming movie Tolkien portrays the life story of J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien? You most likely know the name J.R.R. Tolkien from his stories The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings trilogy, unless you've been living under a rock in Middle-earth for the last 30 years. Starring Nicholas Hoult, the film continues the Hollywood trend of casting a hunky guy in the role of a nerd. I'm looking at you, Eddie Redmayne. And is he really attractive? I mean, he has nice eyes, I suppose. The trailer begins with a bunch of boys roaming around the idyllic Victorian countryside of England, swords in hand, except for one who's hiding behind a wall. And that's, you guessed it, our protagonist Tolkien. See, Tolkien didn't exactly fit in. By age 12, he was already an orphan. He had actually been born in South Africa in 1892, but his mother had been forced to bring he and his brother back to England when his father contracted a fever there and died. Tolkien himself was actually bit by a giant baboon spider while he was only an infant there, and many suspect this was the inspiration behind his later spider baddies. But in England, she was forced to raise the boys by herself as a single working parent, moving from boarding house to boarding house, and by age 34 had worked herself literally to death, succumbing to type 1 diabetes. This left Tolkien in the charge of Father Francis Morgan. See, Tolkien's mother had actually converted to Catholicism when she returned to England, so Tolkien soon found himself embroiled in the Protestant and Catholic conflict of England, which was as much a class conflict as anything. But before she died, she made sure to pass on her love of nature, stories, and writing to her children, something Tolkien took to heart, throwing himself into his education at King Edward's School in Birmingham. And it's really through his studies that Tolkien discovered who he was, forming a secret, literature-loving society with other boys at the school, the Tea Club Barovian Society, or TCBS for short, so named because the group liked to take tea at the Barrow stores, each who pushed the others to strive for greater heights in literature.
We change the world through the power of art.
Music, poetry.
And what about Tolkien?
I want to write something.
But it wasn't just literature that the boys dominated. They quickly rose to the top of their class, and even dominated athletics. Tolkien himself was quite good at rugby, and even played for Oxford. But in his typical Tolkien fashion, after one especially trying match, he composed an epic poem on their struggles. By the time of their graduation, the boys were inseparable. A real true group of comrades, a
fellowship.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. But Hollywood has already made a film about literature-loving high schoolers. It's called Dead Poets Society. What sets the movie Tolkien apart is the love story that comes with it. Forced to move into yet another boarding house with his brother while in school, he met Edith Bratt, who is also an orphan, played here by the fetching Lily Collins. Only 16 when he met her, she was 3 years his senior, and a Protestant. But young love knows no boundaries, and they began to meet daily for tea on the second-floor balcony, where they would throw sugar lumps into the hats of anyone that passed below. In each other, they found an affection missing from their lives, and in the summer of 1909, the two fell in love, but in the typical Edwardian fashion, neither said anything about it. Father Francis, Tolkien's Catholic priest guardian, obviously did not approve of an older Protestant woman corrupting his apt pupil. And when Tolkien's grades began to slip that fall, Father Francis rightfully blamed it on Edith and forbade Tolkien from ever speaking to Edith again, at least until Tolkien was 21 and a full adult and no longer technically his ward. As Tolkien was dependent on Father Francis to pay for his education, food, and very shelter, and his younger brother still needed years of support, Tolkien had no choice but to comply. He abruptly cut off all communication with Edith, but his thoughts never strayed very far from her, and his first year at Oxford would be marked by low grades from his frequent bouts of depression and melancholy from the loss of her. Thankfully, throughout all this, he still had the TCBS, and it's at this time that Tolkien begins to study Latin and Anglo-Saxon, and use it to even begin constructing languages of his own. And it's during this period of his life that so many of the later influences we see in his books start to come to light. A summer trip with the boys to the Alps leads to the inspiration of the Misty Mountains. An early reading of Beowulf inspires the dragon Smaug, and even the brutish orcs of Middle-earth might be named for the Oxford Rugby Club. But even absorbed in his own world of literature, Tolkien's thoughts never strayed far from Edith, and on the day he turned 21, following Father Francis's instructions to the letter, he actually wrote a letter to Edith, professing his love and asking her to marry him. But part of the problem of cutting off all contact and never actually telling someone you care for them is they don't tend to wait around. And Edith had gone off and gotten engaged, so she replied to Tolkien that though she appreciated the letter, she hadn't known to wait, and she had thought that Tolkien frankly had no longer cared for her. The same day Tolkien received her reply, he booked a train to go see Edith. He wasn't about to let the love of his life slip away. They proceeded to walk around town for hours, talking about their dreams, about their hopes, and about what they've been doing with their lives.
I've invented my own.
You invented an entire language?
Yes.
At the end of it, she agreed to return her engagement ring. The likely turning point of the film, though, and the turning point of so many lives in 1914, is the beginning of World War I. Tolkien didn't immediately run off and enlist. Braving public scorn, he actually delayed joining until he completed his degree, knowing that if he survived the war, he had to have a future and a career to support himself and Edith. And when Tolkien completed his finals in July 1915, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant into the Lancashire Fusiliers the very next day. All 4 members of the TCBS joined the service as well. And before shipping to France, they actually met for one last time at a hotel near their training camps in Lichfield, and promising to push each other to write even while they're on the front. But before Tolkien left for the front, he had one last thing to do. In March 1916, he and Edith decided to get hitched. He would later tell his son that he admired his wife for being willing to marry an almost penniless man with no career and no higher prospect than being the possibility of a casualty of the war. The Army, not surprisingly, would turn out to be a very poor fit for the academic-minded Tolkien. He would be overcome by periods of boredom and disgust, and frequently escaped into his writing. But within a month of his arrival, he and the other members of the TCBS had all arrived at the same place. If you don't know anything about World War I history, you've still probably heard of the Battle of the Somme. If you've seen any films about World War I, none of them are exaggerating. Tolkien himself actually participated in the assault on the Schweben Redoubt and the Leipzig salient. He would lead his soldiers in charges across no man's land, but even then the dangers weren't over. While his men were trying to get rest, they were assaulted not by more Germans, but by hordes of lice, who crawled into their clothing and feasted on them at night. Rob Gilson of the TCBS was killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, leading his men over the top of the trench. Jeffrey Smith died in a first aid post, killed by a German artillery shell. The loss of his friends was devastating to Tolkien, and soon he found not only his morale crushed, but his health as well, as he came down with trench fever, a disease transmitted from the lice of Leipzig Redoubt. Now running a high fever and his body racked in pains, Tolkien found himself in the middle of a hellscape. Torrential rains and constant shelling had turned the fields into a boggy mess, full of awful and unclaimed bodies. Driven by his own hallucinations, cavalry corps become Nazgul, enemy flamethrowers become dragons, and explosions on the front turn into the actual shape of a Balrog. The assault failed, and Tolkien, now racked by fever and rickets, was removed from the front lines and sent back to England. Of the original TCBS, only Christopher Wiseman, who had joined the Navy, would survive the war. No longer able to fight, Tolkien's mind turned again to story. One day, while stationed in Yorkshire, he and his wife Edith were walking through a small woodland glade filled with hemlocks, when she began to run, dance, and sing through the flowers. And at that moment, the first true story of Middle-earth formed in his mind. A story of love, of a lost man who had found a seemingly perfect beauty, and of the two worlds that kept them apart. He would go on to be inspired to write of 4 friends who went to war, and the tragedies it brings, of pastoral countrysides and distant peaks, dragons and dark towers. But in his version, all the men would get to come home again, though forever changed. But his first story that he wrote was one of love, of man and elf, baron and Luthien, the names that Tolkien would have inscribed on his and Edith's headstones after some 50 years of marriage. And that's actually likely where the film will end, with Tolkien sitting down and putting pen to paper and beginning a different kind of story. Tolkien arrives in theater on May 10th, 2019, and stars Nicholas Hoult and Lilly Collins. So if you're a fan of the novels or just want a different perspective on World War I, it'll be hard to go wrong. And while you're watching the film, keep your eyes peeled for references to Middle-earth, which it's undoubtedly guaranteed to be laden with. Thanks for watching.